Hey, everybody. I wanted to say a few words about someone I really respect and a great American who entered into hospice yesterday. And as I'm saying this, he's in hospice, and I'll probably post it when he's passed on, and that is Jimmy Carter. I'm not really here to talk about politics, but I have good memories of Jimmy Carter. I actually had dinner with Jimmy Carter once in the Carter Center with three other people, and there were a couple Secret Service guys kind of standing around our little table in the cafeteria at the Carter Center. There was no one else there. I also heard him speak a couple times at the Carter Center, and met him in a sort of receiving line and like a kind of meet and greet mixer type thing. So I've met him a couple times and had dinner with him. And one of the times I met him in a receiving line, he remembered me. So that was kind of nice. Came up and shook my hand and asked me how I was doing and remembered my first name anyway. I don't know. Maybe someone had whispered it to him, but he was a fine man. And the other thing is, I have really good memories of Jimmy Carter because I grew up in the Carter presidency. So people, you might notice this is almost turning into a nostalgia channel. I love the '70s, and I've had a number of people say they like when I comment on the '70s. Well, I grew up in the '70s, and I think we kind of remember Jimmy Carter now different as a different figure than maybe he seemed like in 1976 when he first came on the national scene. And I was too young to vote, but I definitely remember that because I remember watching him get the nomination in 1976. My mom just thought he was great, and my sister and my mom. I think my dad might have been quietly supporting Gerald Ford. I don't know. And you know what? Gerald Ford was also a good man. That was a presidential race, 1976. We had two fine Americans running, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, and that's the way it should always be: an honorable, decent campaign between decent Americans, and that we definitely had that in 1976 with Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. And but I remember the '70s really well, and I remember he had that big grin. And I think he lost to Ronald Reagan in the latter part of his presidency. It was so dominated by the Iran hostage crisis and the energy crisis, but I think especially the Iran hostage crisis. People kind of remember that now, but Jimmy Carter definitely had kind of the hippie vote. But what's kind of also interesting is he was a Christian, and that was a big part of his campaign. So I remember those "I found it" signs people would put on in their house. I remember seeing those around neighborhoods and things. I found it that referred to salvation in Christ. And I remember his brother Billy, and I remember at least one occasion some Billy beer being around. I won't say whether I had any or not, but I remember Billy beer. So I remember him a lot. I think now we kind of remember all the things people have said about him since he lost to Ronald Reagan in 1980. But really, the early part of his presidency was actually pretty good. And the other thing I wanted to say, I've got this album, Eat a Peach. And if you look at Eat a Peach up here, it's you can't. The writing's too small. But right up there, this is Capricorn Records, Eat a Peach by the Allman Brothers Band. And there's a guy that was the president of Capricorn Records in Macon, Georgia. Of course, Jimmy Carter was from Plains, Georgia. And Jimmy Carter was the governor of Georgia from 71 to 75. So that's Allman Brothers prime time. And Phil Walden in Macon was the president of Capricorn Records and had like Otis Redding, I think Wet Willie, but the Allman Brothers would be kind of one of his big acts at that time. And Phil Walden, being kind of an important and also kind of cool rock and roll good old boy, was a big Democrat. Back then all the South was all Democrat. And the Democratic Party should stop ripping on the South all the time and look at that period, because you had a bunch of great Southern Democrats. And this Phil Walden hooked up Jimmy Carter with Greg Allman. So one of the more famous endorsements that Jimmy Carter got was Greg Allman, which was right in there with an endorsement by Willie Nelson, Bob Dylan. Another interesting one was Charlie Daniels. Now, that's another example of how Southern Democrats changed. Charlie Daniels supported Jimmy Carter and, was publicly supported Jimmy Carter. Now, when he died, I think people sort of saw him almost the way people see Ted Nugent, as this kind of a right-wing reactionary or something. But he was a big Jimmy Carter guy, Charlie Daniels. So Jimmy Carter had all the South and black and white voters supported Jimmy Carter in the South, and that was a good thing. But so there was a lot of music, and it was right in the prime time of music. So he would have like the Allman Brothers and things appear with him at different events and rallies. I remember the stories, how he walked around and shook everybody's hand and said, "Hello, my name's Jimmy Carter. I'm running for president," and.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president. It's been a long time.
There with him. But I think Jimmy Carter kind of reflects that too, where he had Christian support. He had the kind of hippie support. I think he had NORML, if you know what that was. Keith Stroop and NORML were strong advocates of Jimmy Carter, and he made quite a few steps in that direction, if you know what NORML is, which were undone in the 80s by Nancy Reagan and things like that. And I don't know, I'm not really trying to comment on that, but I'm just saying the 70s was a pretty different time. And but he was kind of a rock and roll president, and he'd have rock stars in the White House, and right in there with Billy Graham and a lot of the other great Americans of the 1970s, and those are all great Americans. Every name I just mentioned was a great American of the 1970s. I didn't want to get too political, but I will say I think Jimmy Carter was a better president than we remembered him. I was watching a little interview with Jimmy Carter just a little while ago when he on YouTube, just some old interview, and he was talking about the Iran hostage crisis. And he said everybody was telling him to do something. And even Rosalind was telling him to do something. And that's always the impulse. You got this crisis, do something. And he said he could have just like blown Iraq. He could have blown Iran right off the map, And that probably would have made him more popular. He might have won that election in 1980 against Ronald Reagan. But a lot of people would have died, including probably the American hostages. There were 52, 55 hostages. And I remember that really well. And I remember how mad people were. That was my senior year in high school. A lot of people were starting to say Jimmy Carter needs to do something. Although if you think about it, that's like do something. Well, what do you really want him to do? But just blow the place up and then kill a bunch more people. He had the hostages were still alive, and they did come home alive, and that's a major thing, and that was his priority. Not Probably the greatest testimony to why Jimmy Carter was actually a good president is this footage right here. This is the day that the Iranian hostages returned home. Look at the joy in these people's faces. They're home. That's a daughter, that's a wife, that's a mother. Those people are so excited. And Jimmy Carter really staked his presidency on getting those people home. And he took a lot of heat for it. And you know what? That's actually leadership. Yeah, but I remember how mad people were. I remember I went to a football game at the University of Michigan with our church, and there was a big banner that these kids were carrying around the stadium. a big one, and they were kind of carrying it around. It was like written on a sheet, and it said "Nuke the Ayatollah." And I remember when there was a song on the radio, morning radio. I used to hear it when I was getting ready to go get the bus for school. The Chicken Shiites. I doubt they'd make that song today, the Chicken Shiites. But it was, a lot of those morning disc jockeys back then were really kind of funny and always. Today, a lot of them would probably be getting in trouble every 3 seconds, but it was kind of a funny song. But a lot of those kind of sentiments, I think, hurt Jimmy Carter. I think Paul Volcker and the Fed kind of hurt him when interest rates got so high towards the end of his presidency, and it was still kind of close with Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was also a very strong candidate, and a lot of ways, whatever you think about him, I think a very effective president, no doubt. So, but Jimmy Carter was a good man, and he wasn't as bad a president, I don't think, as people sometimes have made him out to be in the last, 40 years since he was president. And of course, he's just been a sterling figure in his post-presidency. I was reading his house in Plains, Georgia is worth $210,000. Now, Plains, Georgia is not exactly, suburban Boston, so it might be kind of a nice house that would be a lot more expensive in other parts of the country. But still, $210,000. You look at some of these politicians that they've worked in government their whole lives. They've never even had like a private sector job, and they are worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And Jimmy Carter was a good man, and he was a Christian man. He was a good man. He was a decent man. He was a kind man that loved America, and he brought people together. I was just thinking how different our country is. We had Charlie Daniels, Bob Dylan, George Wallace. I'm not advocating Wallace, but he was a supporter of Jimmy Carter. Pat Robertson. You had the whole George McGovern wing of the Democratic Party, and a lot of those kind of good old boy Southerners. And the Democrats should take a page out of the playbook, because that was a strong party back then when you had all those kind of good old boy Southerners, and I think they kind of got run off. When I first moved to Georgia in 1993, it was still kind of like that, where everybody was a Democrat, especially a lot of older people. Now, you did have some change, like Newt Gingrich was kind of a significant figure at that time, but that was kind of a new growth metro Atlanta. And if you went to a lot of smaller towns and things, everybody was a Democrat. They wouldn't even bother to say it. It was just like, all the like city officials, all the judges, they were all Democrat. It was, and they were all kind of like that. And everybody I ever talked to of that generation had nothing but positive things to say about Jimmy Carter. And I've lived in Georgia for over 30 years. And let me tell you, that man has respect all over this state from all kinds of different people. And he deserves it. And I look at how wealthy some of our politicians are now. That they've, a lot of them have never made all that much more than, they make pretty good money in Washington, but not enough to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And Jimmy Carter never went down that road. He was a good man. He's taught Sunday school. He was a man of the people. And he was a proud Southerner. I was thinking the other thing, I guess I remember when people thought he was like some kind of raging liberal, which is kind of ridiculous if you look at the way that some of the Democrats are now. But back then, we didn't have all these cultural issues as much. I mean, they were around, but so, you didn't have reproductive freedom. It wasn't as major a thing. There wasn't really much affirmative action. So a lot of the racial politics were kind of feel good. Everybody get along, kumbaya period still a little bit. And it wasn't, you didn't have people at each other's throats as much. Which, if you think about it, has happened a lot, maybe because of the way things have evolved since those days. But in that period, it was kind of feel good, Uh, and he was a good man. He was a very smart man. And I will always say good things about Jimmy Carter. And also, I started thinking about it. And I said, I really remember him as kind of the president when I was listening to FM rock. I mean, he was the president. Jimmy Carter, those big grinning T-shirts. I remember all kinds of Jimmy Carter signs with that. Then a lot of times they'd be almost cartoonish with that big grin, but kind of, in a way they weren't malicious. But he was very much a figure of the 70s and also really closely associated with a lot of great rock and roll in that period. Charlie Daniels, the Allman Brothers, Bob Dylan. He had a bunch of those. Elvin Bishop, I think all those people were big Jimmy Carter fans. And Wet Willie, I think, all those people campaigned with Jimmy Carter. So he definitely, that was a big base of his support, was all those Southern rockers, which was great, and I think Leonard Skinner too. Leonard Skinner was for Jimmy Carter. Of course, they had just, at that time, Sweet Home Alabama was kind of a new song, which was kind of regional pride and even made some references to Nixon and Watergate. And I remember that. And Jimmy Carter kind of ran on a platform of bringing healing back to our country and also kind of decency in government, and got a lot of support. Leonard Skinner were big supporters of Jimmy Carter. So I have good memories of Jimmy Carter. Maybe they're gauzy memories from that time of my life, 16, 17, 18, 15, 19, 20, I don't know, all those years kind of blur together, but right around that time, those are good years anyway. But Jimmy Carter was a good man, and I remember watching him debate Ronald Reagan in 1980. So I remember all that really well, and I wish our country in a lot of ways were still like that. And that's the other thing I remember is how full the Democratic Party was back then, the good old boys. I think about that. Charlie Daniels, Ronnie Van Zant, Greg Allman, they were all big-time Democrats. And they were Southern Democrats, like Sam Nunn or Lloyd Benson, And our nation was stronger when we weren't at each other's throat as much. So I have a lot of respect for Jimmy Carter, and he was a Christian man. So when he dies, I'm sure he will find his peace. But he was a lot better president than a lot of people think. And he lost a close race to Ronald Reagan, who was also a very strong candidate, obviously, needless to say. But I will say I don't think Jimmy Carter was ever too favorable to Ronald Reagan. I remember at that dinner, Ronald Reagan's name came up somewhere or another, and Jimmy Carter kind of looked down. He was kind of that old school. I'm not going to say anything bad, but I had the impression he didn't really want to talk about Ronald Reagan. I didn't bring it up, but someone mentioned Ronald Reagan, and he kind of looked aside a little bit. And, but he was a fine man, and a lot better president than a lot of people think. Our country was in good shape in the 70s. Now, we don't always think of it that way, but look at all the mess we have now. Yeah, we'd all love to go back to 1977. Thanks. God bless.